what if the story of Abraham smashing statues wasn't, a family dispute about religion?
Right.
What if it was actually the literal blueprint for a political revolution?
Yeah, that completely changes the stakes.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because think about the narrative we've all inherited, right? Like the standard Sunday school version.
Right, the picture books.
Exactly. You have young Abraham or Ibrahim having this really emotional, tearful domestic argument with his grumpy pagan father.
The family business, basically.
Right. The dad carves stone idols for a living. They get into a shouting match over aesthetics or whatever, and it ends with the teenager getting kicked out of the house.
A classic sitcom setup, honestly.
Yeah, we frame it entirely as this biological parent-child clash. But when you step into the actual source material we're analyzing today, well, that entire domestic framing just collapses.
It absolutely falls apart.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today we are unpacking the Tului Islam Digital Audio Archive, specifically Lecture 6 of 13, which focuses on Surah Maryam verses 42 through 50.
And this is a massive shift in perspective.
Huge. Our mission for you today is to look at this text through a highly specific analytical framework, one that strips away all that conventional mythology.
Because, if you read this as a family drama about pottery and idols, you completely miss the political science. This is a high-stakes ideological cross-examination.
I want to stop right there because, political science, if I'm sitting here picturing a teenager arguing with a carpenter, stakes feel very low.
Exactly. Yep.
But you're saying the father in this text isn't just a grumpy dad in a workshop. So if we are stripping away the mythology, who exactly is the father, the Ab, that Ibrahim is confronting?
Well, in the structural framework we are analyzing from the source, the word Ab is utilized to represent the ultimate custodian of institutional conditioning.
Okay, so wait, not just a literal dad?
No, not merely a biological parent.
Right.
He is a high-ranking official.
Right.
He is the powerful elite embedded in the ruling status quo.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the source explicitly compares his role to a powerful mandarin, right? Or to a figure like Haman in the court of Pharaoh.
So he's the establishment personified.
Exactly. He holds the keys to the societal operating system.
Wait, so the text uses the term for father to represent the state bureaucracy.
Yes.
That's a massive pivot. But I suppose, it makes psychological sense.
How so?
Well, if you think about the ancient world, the state and the patriarchal family structure were basically indistinguishable, right? The ruler was literally the father of the nation. So when Ibrahim is standing before this Ab, he isn't arguing about whether a stone statue looks nice in the living room.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He is delivering a data-driven empirical assault against a corrupt civilizational operating system.
A data-driven assault. I love that phrasing.
Because Ibrahim's analysis has determined that this operating system has zero functional utility for human progress.
It's just broken.
It's a system built entirely on blind tradition rather than objective merit. So when you reframe the Ab as the established institutional power, the entire conversation shifts.
From a domestic squabble to a revolutionary tribunal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ibrahim is putting the state itself on trial.
So if you're listening to this, I want you to consider the systems you operate in right now, like whether that's a rigid corporate hierarchy or a political party structure or even, deeply ingrained academic circles.
We see it everywhere.
We really do. We constantly mistake systemic structural conflicts for mere personality clashes. We think, oh, I'm just arguing with a stubborn manager.
Right, my boss just doesn't get it.
Yeah. When in reality, we are colliding with an entire unyielding framework of, well, this is how we have always done things.
And that is the exact universal collision the source material is highlighting here.
Okay, so how does the text actually break that down?
Well, it lays out the architectural blueprint of what happens when the vanguard of reason hits the brick wall of entrenched tradition.
The brick wall.
Yeah. And to understand the mechanics of this boardroom-level clash, we have to look really closely at the specific vocabulary used in the text.
Right, the linguistic deep dive.
Because the source material does something fascinating here. It redefines three key terms from abstract, spooky concepts into hard sociological data points.
And those words are ilm, shian, and ab.
Yes. Let's start with ilm.
Okay, because traditionally, when Ibrahim says, knowledge has come to me, well, the immediate assumption is mystical, right?
Right, the cultural baggage.
Exactly. The cultural baggage we bring to that phrase makes us picture a guy standing on a mountain receiving a sudden supernatural vision, like a beam of light from the sky.
So when Ibrahim says knowledge has come to me, He isn't talking about a mystical vision.
Wait, I'm asking you. The source material completely rejects that interpretation, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely not, no. In the Tului Islam analytical framework, ilm explicitly means objective, verified data.
Objective data.
Yes. It is empirical evidence gathered through observation and the application of reason. It is the absolute antithesis of a mystical hunch.
Hang on, though. I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Sure.
We are talking about ancient history. They didn't have spreadsheets, right? They didn't have data analytics software.
Obviously not, yeah.
So what does objective verified data actually look like for Ibrahim in this specific historical context? Like, what is he literally bringing to the Mandarin?
Well, it looks like observational social science.
Okay.
Think about the economic and social realities of his time. The data Ibrahim possesses is the visible empirical failure of the current system.
Oh, so like poverty metrics.
Exactly. He can point to the consolidation of wealth among the elite. He can point to the disenfranchisement of the working class.
The things that are right in front of their faces.
Yes. Corruption of the justice system, the stagnation of human development.
So it's very tangible.
Completely tangible. When he stands before the custodian of the state and says, "Knowledge has come to me," he is effectively saying, "I have analyzed the systemic data of our social physics.
Wow.
I have mapped the inputs and the outputs of your policies, and the math doesn't lie. Your ancestral traditions cannot solve human problems."
So it's basically like a whistleblower stepping into an executive boardroom.
That's a perfect analogy.
Like imagine the board of directors is sitting there in their mahogany chairs, totally comfortable, just coasting on legacy momentum.
Collecting their bonuses.
Right. And Ibrahim walks in with a comprehensive audit, drops it on the table, and says, look at the numbers. Our core product is failing. The market has shifted. Your foundational assumptions are bankrupt.
But the board just crosses their arms.
Exactly. They insist on relying on how we've always done things because, well, admitting the data is accurate means they have to surrender their power.
That is precisely the dynamic. The elite cannot accept the ilm because the ilm invalidates their authority.
It's a threat to their survival.
Yes, and that realization leads perfectly into how the source material redefines the second critical term, shayan.
Ah, right. Because when I hear the word shayan, my cultural conditioning immediately conjures up a monster hiding under the bed.
A literal demon.
Yeah, a supernatural boogeyman with horns whispering evil thoughts into people's ears. But if we are treating this text as a manual for social physics,
Which we are.
then a literal demon doesn't fit the equation. So how does the Tului Islam framework define it?
Well, the source strips away the superstition completely. It defines shayan strictly by its action within a system.
Okay, so it's a verb, almost.
Kind of, yeah. To understand it, you first have to understand the concept it is actively rebelling against, which is Ar-Rahman.
Right, Aram.
In this analytical model, Ar-Rahman represents the universal laws of sustenance, equity, and balanced development for all of humanity.
Okay, so the baseline algorithm.
Exactly. It is the systemic equilibrium where every single human being has access to the resources they need to develop their potential.
So if Ar-Rahman is the healthy, balanced, algorithmic baseline of a functioning society,
Then shayan is the active driver of systemic imbalance.
the bug in the code.
It is the active driver of exploitation. The word itself, in this context, is defined as a rebellion against those laws of equitable sustenance.
Wait, so it's not a ghost, it's a corrupted policy.
Yes.
It's an economic structure that starves the working class just to artificially inflate the wealth of the elite. It's a hoarding mechanism.
Exactly. It is structural violence.
Wow.
So when Ibrahim tells the father, the establishment, that they are serving shayan, he isn't accusing them of participating in some spooky occult ritual in the woods.
He is pointing out a cold sociological fact.
Right. He is saying, look at your institutions, look at your tax codes, your labor laws, your social hierarchies. They're serving an active driver of exploitation.
That is heavy.
And by demanding that the populace obey this system, you are legally forcing society to serve its own systemic rot.
That reframing changes everything. He is holding up a mirror to the structural violence of the status quo.
He is.
Which brings us back to the psychological genius of using the word ab, or the father figure, to represent this corrupt state.
Yes, the linguistics are so intentional.
Because, I mean, why use the parent metaphor at all? If Ibrahim is critiquing the state, why not just say the king or the governor?
Because the state relies on the psychology of filial piety. to survive.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right. The father represents the safety of the known. He represents the biological imperative to obey, the sanctity of tradition, the way of the ancestors.
That's deeply psychological.
Very. Overturning the father means overturning the foundational assumptions of the entire society. It is the hardest psychological chain to break.
I see. Because if the state can condition you to unquestioningly obey your parents simply because they are your parents.
Regardless of what they do.
Right. Even when their actions are objectively harmful or illogical, then you are perfectly primed to unquestioningly obey a corrupt state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You've been trained from birth that authority supersedes evidence.
Wow. And this leads us directly into the massive psychological conflict explored in the sources, right? The global myth of blind obedience versus the engine of reason.
Yes. The text is setting up Ibrahim's unyielding reliance on reason against a global cultural expectation that you must never, ever question ancestral authority.
And to illustrate just how pervasive this cultural expectation is globally, the source material utilizes a really fascinating comparative analysis.
It does. And
Actually, let me just clarify for the listener real quick. We are neutrally reporting on the source's analytical comparison here.
right, we're not taking sides.
Right. We aren't endorsing or attacking any specific religion. The author of the source material uses this comparative analysis purely as a sociological tool to demonstrate a universal law of social physics.
Exactly. They bring in an analysis of the epic of the Ramayana to highlight a global phenomenon regarding how societies manufacture compliance.
Okay, so walk us through that comparison. What is the source highlighting there?
Well, the comparison is deeply revealing about human social engineering. The source highlights how, in that specific narrative, the character of Ram is culturally deified precisely because he obeys an irrational, objectively unjust command.
Right, from his father.
Yes. His father, who is being manipulated by his stepmother, commands Ram to abandon his rightful meritorious place on the throne.
Even though he's the best guy for the job.
Exactly. And the command is for him to go into exile in the wilderness for 14 years.
And Ram just does it.
He does.
He doesn't pull out the data. He doesn't point out the systemic injustice of the command or the damage it will do to the kingdom to lose its most capable leader.
No, he doesn't debate it at all.
He obeys simply to fulfill his father's blind promise. He suffers in silence.
And the critical insight from the source here is that traditional societies prize this exact behavior above all else.
They want that compliance.
They engineer their mythologies to prize blind obedience over logic. The hero is the one who suffers quietly to uphold the traditional hierarchy, no matter how deeply flawed or destructive that hierarchy is.
Because it's the ultimate firewall for a corrupt establishment.
Exactly.
Like, if you can convince the populace that asking why is a moral failing, the ruling class never has to justify its actions.
They are completely insulated.
Right. If the cultural ideal, the highest form of virtue, is a son who walks into the jungle rather than challenge a bad administrative decision, the system is perfectly insulated against reform.
You've turned suffering into a virtue.
And if suffering is a virtue, the state never has to improve the material conditions of the people.
That is the exact social physics at play.
It's brilliant in a really dark way.
It is. And this is why Ibrahim's disruption, as analyzed in the source, is so incredibly revolutionary.
Because he doesn't play that game.
The Quranic framework actively rejects absolute obedience to parents or to any state authority if that obedience contradicts reason and objective truth.
It just shatters the global model of compliance.
It does. Ibrahim doesn't walk into the jungle.
Yeah.
He doesn't submit to the unjust command.
He flips the script entirely.
Yeah.
He looks at the ultimate authority figure of his society and basically says, follow me.
Right.
Think about the audacity of that. A young man with no institutional power telling the supreme custodian of the state to get in line behind him.
It's unthinkable in a traditional framework.
And why? Not because of his bloodline, not because he had a louder voice, but because he has the data.
Yeah.
He says, I have the ilm, and I will guide you on an even logical path.
He is demanding that the hierarchy of society be based on merit, evidence, and systemic utility, rather than biology and tradition.
Basically saying, follow me because my spreadsheet works and yours is bankrupting the civilization.
Exactly. But the author of the source material makes a brilliant, almost unquestionable point about human psychology here.
Oh, about the burden of reason.
Yes, they discuss the burden of reason. Because, let's be honest, blindly following ancestors is incredibly easy.
It is. It's comfortable.
It is a fantastic way to avoid the heavy lifting of using your own intellect.
Absolutely. Cognitive exertion requires a lot of energy.
It's exhausting, evaluating evidence, challenging norms, and constantly recalibrating your worldview based on new data, it's hard work.
Right. So if you can just outsource your morality and your decision-making to how we've always done things, you never have to experience cognitive dissonance.
You never have to be wrong.
And you never have to take responsibility for systemic failures either. You just shrug and say, well, those are the rules. I didn't make them. I'm just doing what my father did.
It's the ultimate abdication of personal responsibility.
Yeah.
And Ibrahim is refusing to let them hide behind that shield. He is demanding that the society wake up, shoulder the burden of critical thinking, and take ownership of their social architecture.
And that demand is terrifying to an establishment that relies on passive compliance to maintain its wealth and power.
Which brings us to the psychological and political climax of this encounter.
The showdown.
Right. We have the clash between the establishment's emotional defensiveness and Ibrahim's unyielding logic.
Let's look at the actual dialogue from the text for this part, because it exposes the absolute impotence of the elite's argument.
It really does.
Right, so Ibrahim asks a perfectly logical, almost painfully obvious question. He says essentially, why serve what does not hear, see, or benefit you?
And we must remember, he isn't just talking about stone ears and stone eyes on a physical statue.
That's just the metaphor.
Right. He is describing a blind, deaf, and dumb political and economic system, a system that is entirely unresponsive to the needs of the people.
A system that cannot see the poverty in its streets.
Yes.
A system that cannot hear the grievances of its workers. A system that provides no actual benefit or functional utility to the society it governs.
It just exists to sustain itself.
It's a devastating empirical critique. So how does the elite Mandarin respond to this? I mean, he has the entire weight of the state behind him.
He has everything.
He has the scribes, the economists, the military. What is his logical counter-argument?
He has none.
Nothing.
The father's response contains zero data. There is zero logical defense of the system's utility.
He doesn't say, well, actually, Ibrahim, if you look at the recent census, our system increased agricultural yields by 20% last quarter.
No, he doesn't have those numbers.
He doesn't point to a booming middle class or a fair justice system because he can't. The data isn't on his side.
The systemic rot is mathematically undeniable.
So what does a powerful establishment do when cornered by empirical proof?
It pivots to the only tool it has left.
Which is?
Violent exclusion. When an establishment runs out of logical proof, it relies on its monopoly on force.
Wow.
The father issues a literal threat of physical erasure. The Arabic phrase used in the text is la arjamanaka.
La arjamanaka.
Yes. It means agree with our traditions, stop questioning the system, or I will stone you to death and banish you from my sight.
Wow. It is the ultimate admission of intellectual bankruptcy.
Completely.
The source refers to this dynamic as the tyranny of unproven assertions.
Yes.
The status quo doesn't survive because it is right or efficient or beneficial. It survives purely because it holds veto power over your life.
I can't prove you wrong, but I can make you disappear.
That is chilling.
But it's a predictable algorithm in social physics. We see this pattern repeated throughout human history whenever a genuine paradigm shift is proposed.
The initial response is almost never a polite debate.
Rarely. The initial response of entrenched power to overwhelming data is suppression.
Because engaging in debate requires the establishment to acknowledge that the challenger's premise is valid.
Exactly. It acknowledges the idea that the system can be questioned.
Yeah.
And they cannot afford to validate that premise.
Okay, so let's put ourselves in Ibrahim's shoes for a second.
Okay.
You have just brought bulletproof data to the state. You have proven their system is failing.
Right.
And the supreme custodian of your society has just threatened you with a brutal, violent execution.
A literal death threat.
The guy essentially has a gun to your head, systemically speaking. How do you react?
Right. What's the natural instinct?
And the natural human instinct is either a fight or flight response. You panic, you beg for your life, or, you start screaming back and throwing rocks.
You match their energy.
Yeah. So how does Ibrahim handle this extreme psychological pressure?
This is where the source breaks down a really fascinating psychological concept, hilm.
Hilm?
Yes. It is usually translated roughly as forbearance. But in this analytical framework, it is much deeper than just politely holding your tongue.
So what is it?
Hilm is extreme emotional regulation born out of absolute, unshakable certainty in your data.
Oh, I like that. The source explicitly notes that Hilm isn't about being weak or being a pushover or submitting out of fear.
Not at all.
It uses this amazing analogy of a powerful, healthy animal that isn't easily spooked. Like someone with Hilm doesn't fly off the handle because they aren't insecure about their position.
Precisely. Emotional volatility in a debate is usually a symptom of intellectual insecurity. If you know your data is bulletproof, you don't need to shout. You don't need to match the state's aggression.
So how does he respond to the threat of violent execution?
With a single, highly calibrated word,
Peace?
or salam.
Okay, now I have to push back on the traditional reading of this.
Go for it.
Because salam is usually translated as a polite greeting or maybe a passive submission, like, okay, peace, I surrender, don't hurt me.
Turning the other cheek.
Exactly. But the source material completely rejects that reading of salam in this context, doesn't it?
It absolutely rejects it. In this high-stakes ideological clash, salam is not a surrender. It is a calculated, unshakable boundary.
A boundary.
Yes. It is Ibrahim saying, I am not going to engage with your emotional volatility. I am not going to descend into a reactionary screaming match because that would legitimize your irrationality.
I'm not playing your game.
Exactly. I am stepping out of your paradigm of violence entirely. It is the establishment of a boundary of security.
It's a massive power move, honestly.
It really is.
It's the ultimate diffusion tactic, but without giving an inch of ideological ground. He completely neutralizes their attempt to bait him into a physical conflict.
And he doesn't just say salam and walk away.
Right, there's a follow-up.
He follows it up with a phrase that usually gets translated as, I will pray for your forgiveness.
Which, again, sounds incredibly Sunday school.
Very pious.
Like, I'll pray for your soul, Dad, even though you're kicking me out.
Right.
But the Tolu Islam framework breaks this down entirely differently, right? He promises to seek istighfar for his father.
Yes. And this is one of the most brilliant linguistic insights from the source material. Istighfar shares an etymological root with the word maifar.
Maifar.
And maifar literally means a helmet.
Wait, a helmet, like actual armor.
Exactly like armor, a piece of protective armor used in battle.
Okay.
So seeking istighfar doesn't mean offering a generic mystical prayer for a pardon of sins in some afterlife.
What does it mean then?
It means actively seeking and constructing protection.
Protection from what? The state just threatened to kill him. Why is he building a helmet for the state?
Protection from the inevitable, mathematically certain, destructive consequences of following a flawed system.
Oh, wow.
Ibrahim understands the laws of social physics. He knows that a society built on exploitation, irrationality, and the hoarding of resources.
A society serving Cheyenne.
Exactly. He knows that society will eventually collapse under its own weight. It is inevitable.
Because a system that doesn't feed its base will eventually run out of energy and implode.
Exactly. The physics demand it. So he is telling the establishment, you are driving this civilizational train off a cliff. The math says you will crash.
And they refuse to listen.
So I am stepping off the train, but I will do everything in my power to build a parallel system of protection, a maifar, a helmet, so that when your systemic crash happens, the human beings caught inside your flawed architecture might be shielded from the absolute worst of the fallout.
That is just, I mean, it's a staggering level of rational empathy.
It really is.
He is setting an absolute boundary. He refuses to participate in the corruption for one more second, but he isn't wishing for their destruction out of spite.
No, he isn't hoping they burn.
He is objectively stating, your system will fail because it violates the laws of nature. I will dedicate my life to building a buffer.
It highlights the crucial difference between personal animosity and systemic opposition.
Aye.
Ibrahim doesn't hate the Ab on a petty, personal level. He is diametrically opposed to the system the Ab represents.
He wants to dismantle the architecture of exploitation, but protect the humanity of the people trapped within it.
Exactly.
Which perfectly transitions us to the actual mechanics of how you do that.
Yes, the action plan.
Because it's one thing to say, I'm going to build a parallel system. It's another thing to actually execute it when the state controls the money, the land, and the military.
It's extremely difficult.
So this brings us to the concept of Istighfar in verses 48 through 50. Ibrahim realizes the establishment is not going to change. They have explicitly chosen violence over data. So what is the strategic next step?
Well, the required strategic mechanism in this framework is Iqazal, which translates to strategic isolation, or complete, formal dissociation from the correct system.
Now, I really struggle with this concept practically.
Okay.
Because we hear the exact opposite advice all the time today, right? In modern politics or corporate culture, people always say, don't quit, change it from the inside.
Ah, yes. Get a seat at the table.
Exactly. You have to get a seat at the table to make a difference. If you leave, you're just abandoning the institution to the bad guys.
Right.
Why does this specific manual of social physics argue that changing it from the inside is the wrong strategic move?
Because of the law of requital.
Which is?
Which is the foundational law of cause and effect in social physics. The source material argues that you cannot build a healthy, equitable social model on a contaminated, exploitative foundation. If the very bedrock of a system, its constitution, its economic incentives, its core power dynamics, is built on irrationality, any reform you try to enact from within will eventually be co-opted, neutralized, or crushed by the overarching architecture.
Wow. So it's like trying to build a state-of-the-art, sustainable green energy home on top of a toxic waste dump.
That's a great way to put it.
It doesn't matter how beautiful the solar panels are or how efficient the insulation is, the foundation is actively poisoning the water supply.
Right.
You can't reform the waste dump by building a nice living room on top of it. You have to walk away and find clean ground.
Precisely. The system's immune response will always attack the reform. So Ibrahim executes Itazal.
He walks away.
He formally severs his economic, political, and social dependencies on the corrupt system. He doesn't just walk out of a physical house. He removes his node from their network entirely.
He unplugs.
Completely. He stops relying on their supply chains, he rejects their social credit system, and he relinquishes any political protection they offered.
But wait, how does he survive that?
It's hard.
That is terrifying. He is walking into the absolute unknown. He's giving up the immense privilege, wealth, and security that came with being tied to the highest levels of the establishment.
Yes.
You can't just declare Itazal today and stop buying groceries or paying taxes. You'll starve or end up in jail. How does he actually survive the separation?
By immediately transitioning from isolation to construction.
Construction.
Yes. Itazal is not merely running away. It is clearing the site to build. And let's look at the predictable output provided in the text.
Okay, verses 48 through 50.
Because this isn't a tragic story of a guy who walks into the desert with his principles and just starves to death.
Right.
The text states that the exact moment Ibrahim definitively separates from the ride, he's granted Ishaq and Yaqub.
Now, traditionally, a literal reading just says he had a son and a grandson, Isaac and Jacob.
But again, we are reading this through the analytical, sociological lens of the source material.
Right. This isn't just an ancient genealogy record being recited for the sake of trivia. So what do Ishaq and Yaqub represent in the context of social physics?
They represent the establishment and validation of a robust, multi-generational succession model.
Break the mechanics of that down for me. How does having a son and grandson prove his systemic theory?
Well, by severing ties with the dying, corrupt system, Ibrahim cleared the ideological and physical space to build a parallel operating system.
One based on ilm and al-Ramah.
Exactly. Data and equitable sustenance. Ishaq and Yaqub represent the continuity of that new system.
I see.
It proves that his revolutionary model wasn't a flash in the pan. It wasn't just a charismatic cult of personality that died the moment Ibrahim passed away.
Because it's scale.
Yes. It had the structural integrity to be passed down, to scale up, and to successfully govern future generations. He built an institution that outlasted the sprawling empire he walked away from.
That is the ultimate proof of his data. The math worked.
The parallel system thrived while the old system collapsed.
And this success culminates in this incredible phrase in the text, right? Lisana ijganalia.
Yes. A tongue of soaring truth.
Which means what, exactly?
It translates to an undisputed, soaring reputation for systemic truth and structural integrity that lasts throughout history.
So because his parallel system was built on objective data and universal laws of sustenance rather than blind tradition and violence, it stood the test of time.
It became the historical gold standard for social organization.
Man. So, bringing this all back to the listener.
Yeah, let's ground this.
If you are sitting in a corporate job right now, or you're involved in a political organization, and you have the data, you know the foundation of the institution is toxic and actively causing harm.
You see the rot?
You have to ask yourself, are you trying to fix a toxic culture by sending a polite email to HR while still relying on that exact culture to pay your mortgage?
Right.
What would your own itizal, your own strategic separation actually look like? What specific economic or social dependencies would you have to cut to finally be able to build on clean ground?
It's a daunting question.
It really is.
It is arguably the most difficult question a person can face. But according to this framework of social physics, it is the absolute required mechanism for real change.
There's no way around it.
No. You cannot achieve systemic balance until you completely remove your consent, your labor, and your participation from the imbalance.
Incredible. Ibrahim completely severs ties with the old world to establish an uncompromised parallel system. But he wasn't the only leader to execute this manual of social physics. How does this universal law of revolutionary struggle manifest across other distinct historical vanguards?
The pattern is completely unbroken. In Lecture 713, we move into Surah Maryam, Ayat 51-4-4, where we analyze how the very same rational infrastructure and systemic demands were placed upon Musa. The architectural blueprint scales up, and we'll break down exactly how it happened. See you in the next session.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We spent a lot of time today talking about the burden of reason and how terrifying it is for a society to let go of its ancestral traditions, even when the data proves those traditions are destructive. Look at our own modern global systems, the economic paradigms, the way we structure our cities, the way we manage resources. If the ultimate test of a healthy society is its willingness to abandon how things have always been done in favor of objective data, how close is our own society to the breaking point Ibrahim faced? If the data proved your most cherished ancestral tradition, your most comfortable institutional habit, was actively harming the future of society, would you have the courage to execute your own intisodal and walk away?